So with that, we're going to move to our keynote panel, and I'm going to introduce Larry Shirley, who is IREC's chair of our board of directors, and he will introduce the panel. And Larry is also going to be the master of ceremonies for the rest of the day. So you'll hear him keeping you on time and moving throughout the day. Thanks.
All right, welcome. I want to extend my thanks to all of you and ask my panelists if they'll please make their way up here. I want to extend my welcome to you. I've already tried to shake hands with 6 people, okay, and no one has even flinched. So I don't take it personally, but I'm probably going to try to shake your hand as well today. I'm a little slow getting used to this. So we have 2 of our panelists today joining us remotely and 2 on stage. This is the keynote panel. This is Pathways and Strategies for Achieving 100% Clean Energy. This panel is geared to providing perspectives from the standpoint of several different sectors regarding the challenges, the obstacles, and the various options that we have that we're going to need as we pursue a 100% clean energy future. Larry has mentioned in the past in some of his talks how challenging and daunting this is to get to 100%. But folks, we have got to get there. And if we're going to make it, we're going to have the legislative, regulatory, industry, consumers, and nonprofits all pushing that boulder up the hill together. Our esteemed panel today features the Honorable Senator Eduardo Bhatia from Puerto Rico. Senator, welcome. Please welcome the Senator. We're so fortunate to have him with us here today. He led the effort as Senate President to pass the most comprehensive energy legislation in Puerto Rico. We also featured today Lorraine Akiba, a fellow IREC board member who recently served for 6 years on the Public Service Commission in Hawaii. She was a leader during that time of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC. And she works today hard in Hawaii, helping ensure that solar gets into low-income communities and is available and accessible to all in Hawaii. Our third panelist, and representing those who purchase renewable energy, companies and consumers, we have Bryn Baker. Bryn is Director of Policy Innovation at the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, REBA. Previously, she spent 10 years with the World Wildlife Fund as their Deputy Director for Climate Change and Renewable Energy. And finally, coming to us virtually, is the gentleman who is the guru who can explain how we integrate all this growing solar and wind into a complex grid structure. Mark knows all these things, right, Mark? Mark Ahlstrom is the president.
Well, I'll try.
He's the president of the nonprofit Energy Systems Integration Group, and he's also the vice president for renewable energy policy for NextEra, one of the largest owners of renewable energy in the United States. So as you can see, we've got quite a panel with us today. We'll give you a chance to ask question and answers at the end. But first, I'm going to ask each of the panelists, if they would, to tell us more about what they do and how they are contributing to try to make 100% clean energy a reality in this country. Let's start with Lorraine.
Thank you, Larry, and aloha, everyone. A virtual hug. You forgot that one, I think, Larry. I forgot that one, but yes. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here and see so many enthusiastic and committed fellow stakeholders on this journey in the room, and also probably, dialed in virtually for today. So what I'm continuing to do is I think it's really important, as we all voted just a few minutes ago. I mean, the overwhelming sentiment across our country, across the world, is the realization that climate change impacts are affecting us daily as we speak. And some areas those impacts are even greater. I'd say islands like Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and Senator Bhatia will agree, are at ground zero for the impacts of climate change. So all the more reason why we must work actively to 100% clean energy realization. I think it's important, and we'll go into this more in detail, but I've stayed committed to trying to promote thought leadership in that area. But devil's in the details, right? We can all agree and have alignment, but actually implementing is very difficult. So really trying to bring people together for honest dialogue, transparent dialogue, to figure out all the details that folks like Mark will tell us in terms of the grid infrastructure, using technology tools, as we have other stakeholders that are providing new tools that we didn't even have 5 years ago, using inverters and using the power control systems that are in energy storage and electric vehicles. But it does take basic work by decision makers, by regulators, to facilitate that change, to set the right regulatory framework so utilities can make the transition to new business models in this 100% clean energy world that we are moving quickly to. And I think that's the role that I would like to play, is helping to facilitate that thought leadership, having to help to facilitate that dialogue, so we get down to the nitty gritty, and we work out those details to actually implement and not just talk. And I always use the analogy, Hawaii, we have the proud history of being having our indigenous peoples, the Polynesian voyagers. They were wayfinders. They navigated and circumnavigated the globe only by the stars. And so I think we should take that as an inspiration. This is an uncharted course for some of us, but we can make that journey if we keep our eye on the North Star of achieving 100% clean energy. And we all definitely need to row in that same canoe, because if we're rowing into opposite directions, as you said, we won't get that, we won't get that stone up the hill, and we won't reach our destination on this journey. So that's what I'm doing.
Thank you, Lorraine. Senator Bhatia, what are your thoughts?
Yes. Well, thank you so much. My apologies for not being there. I wish I could have been there. I unfortunately was not able to fly out because of all the health reasons that we all know about. However, I wanted to bring to your attention the case of Puerto Rico. We had for about 80 years, we have a state-owned monopoly, a state-owned utility that basically burns fossil fuels. And there's number one, the first issue I would like to raise to you is the idea of the resistance that the utility itself has placed on renewable energy. So there's a culture of burning fossil fuels. There's a culture in Puerto Rico, and I want to point that right away, because even though we have had hurricanes over the last century or so or more, Puerto Rico has never moved into using solar energy and distributed energy, precisely because the government itself owns the utility, and the government is the one that has been placing all the barriers for citizens to actually disconnect or develop the distributed energy that we need down here. We lived perhaps the worst nightmare after Hurricane Maria. For about 6 to 8 months, we had no energy. And having a whole island with 3.5 million people, that's bigger than 25 states of the Union. 3.5 million people having the economy shut down because there was no energy. It's really a disgrace. And so what came out of that was, number one, that we had to move into a cleaner energy for environmental reasons, but also because cleaner energy and distributed energy would help Puerto Rico pick up in the case of future hurricanes, and in the case of future, now we're experiencing a whole bunch of earthquakes, and a whole bunch of earthquakes close to where the main generation centers are. So we have also had to shut down generation centers, and again, having more blackouts. So for us, the idea of moving into renewable energy comes with a component of distributed energy. The one resource that we have lots of in Puerto Rico is sun, and we have lots of rooftops. The question then, and the great challenge is, how do we move into a new culture of rooftops and solar energy.
Thank you, Senator. Bryn, your thoughts?
Good morning. Thank you. Thanks for being here, for having me. And I'm coming to this bringing the customer perspective. So maybe I'll just start out with just a minute on REBA. I'm sure many of you are familiar with REBA, but we're still a fairly new organization. It started out about 5 years ago as a collection of NGO initiatives, and a lot of what brought REBA together was the fact that corporations, but not just corporations, cities and higher ed, were all starting to set these goals and struggling with how to meet them. There were a few early movers that had figured out how to do some power purchase agreements, and then everybody was trying to kind of figure out how to move the cog themselves and really ending up reinventing the wheel. And so we said we need to bring everybody together and create a community where people can learn from one another about how to accelerate this space. And fast forward 6 years, well, actually last year, it was just a year ago, that REBA spun out as its own independent organization. And I think that's a bit of a watershed moment from the customer side, because it was saying businesses, but not just businesses, again, higher ed, localities, healthcare systems are saying, we're ready for an organization that's ready to go out and help expand access dramatically, because we've got these goals and we're hitting barriers and we're hitting walls, and we've got to figure out how to accelerate this space. So that's really what REBA's role is to help us accelerate the transformative impact that customers are already having in driving this transformation by raising their voice, amplifying their voice as they continue to demand more and more access to clean energy. And so REBA has a vision that goes beyond, I mean, we are the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, but we have a vision that goes beyond that, because our vision is a resilient, zero carbon energy system. Importantly, where every organization has a viable, expedient, and cost-effective pathway to renewable energy. And so that's really what we are about, is scaling up that impact. We have a goal to deploy 60 gigawatts of new renewable energy. We're about 25 gigawatts of the way there. And so companies, largely companies, but again, not only companies, have signed contracts for about 25 gigawatts of new renewable energy. That's utility scale over the last 10 years. The vast majority of it just in the last 5 years, which again tells you how much this is taking off. And given that we're almost halfway there, what that goal is by 2025, we're already saying, well, we've got to set a new goal. But again, I think a lot of this discussion is going to be about not just what barriers are customers hitting, but what are the barriers in the system. And so I think that's where I would actually really agree with where the polling came out. One of the maybe surprising and hard to predict things about the last 10, even 20 years is the role that the voluntary bottom-up actors, companies, states, localities, are playing in sort of taking up this mantle of leadership and saying, there's a business case for this. We want this. This makes sense for a whole host of other reasons beyond just liking renewable energy.
Thank you, Bryn. I can bear witness to the fact I come from North Carolina, where I was the energy director for a decade, and the game changer in North Carolina, we now have we're the second state behind California in terms of installed solar capacity, was when the tech companies came in, and the tech companies said, we need large amounts of solar, we demand large amounts of solar and renewables to power our server farms and other instruments. And suddenly our conservative legislature had to take notice, and it kept us moving forward in the state during tough political times. So it's amazing what the purchasers of renewable energy can do. I want to turn to Mark now. Mark, so glad to have you. I understand Mark was told by his wife that if he came to this meeting live, he would not be allowed to come back into the house. And in fact, she might leave, and she's taking the kids. So anyway, we're glad to have Mark any way we can get him. Mark?
Well, thank you so much. Yes. I'm Mark Ahlstrom. As was mentioned here, wear two hats, really. I'm a clean energy guy to the core. But my day job is with NextEra Energy on the what we call non-regulated side, where we're the largest independent developer of renewable projects really in the world. Mostly the larger scale, but we're also involved with commercial, industrial, and other distributed resources. And we work very closely. I've been working a lot over the last year on how we hybridize batteries with PV, for example, into creating the best possible power plants for the system operators. Yeah, one of the reasons why we have a lot of travel bans on this side is I work very closely with the system operators. And of course, the utilities and the ISO RTO folks have been really the first to lock down because of their concerns about their control responsibilities and their reliability. So we've seen travel bans throughout the industry going very quickly. But the other half that I have aware is with the Energy Systems Integration Group, which is a nonprofit educational technical group that's been around for 30 years. Started out as a utility wind interest group and helped utilities learn how to deal with this and was involved with many of the different studies of how to actually operate the grid with higher penetrations. We really try to provide that technical engineering educational role in a non-advocating but forward-leaning way. And I wish I could be with you there today, but fortunately, I believe Rick O'Connell is there from Grid Lab, was on the board of ESIG, and we work together literally every week with a slightly different mission in this space on the technical side. And really the bottom line on the technology is, we're in the midst of an amazing revolution here. I mean, we're taking a 100-year-old system that was built on very conventional spinning generators, and we're now throwing, electronics and software and batteries and everything into this. The reliability issue is important, but that really comes down to coordination, the ability to plan and model and do this. And then we'll talk about the real challenge coming up is, how do we make this transition of this huge, very valuable system to us in a way that's reliable. So I look forward to the discussion, and I'm happy to participate any way I can.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. So I want to ask our panelists if they would talk a little bit about what they see as the top one or two challenges to making 100% clean energy happen and to the implementation of that effort. Lorraine?
I think the two top challenges I see really are when you get to a high level of penetration. I mean, and in Hawaii, it's been the case, the living laboratory sending postcards in the future that we're blessed with a lot of renewable resources. I mean, solar, wind, hydro, and biomass, and a lot of other things in the toolkit that aren't there from an energy perspective. But when you get to a higher level of penetration, it's really integrating that into a modern grid. So there's a lot of capital expenditure, and how do you manage that, and how do you incent both customers that can help support the grid, larger customers, or even individual rooftop solar customers, as we are seeing in Hawaii, can use behind the meter resources to help support this transition. So it's not just the utility spending its resources and trying to do all things for all people, but it is the challenge of accessibility and affordability for all customers, which is, what I think the REBA is here to address. That is a challenge because, early adopters, people that have the income and the level to do that, people that live in structures that they can put distributed resources into their homes. Not everybody is in that situation. What do we do for multifamily unit dwellers, renters, people? They don't have to be low, moderate income. It could be people that are in luxury condos, but they're never going to have access unless we have other programs such as community renewables, community solar. And this has to all be done in an integrated way. And when you get to you picked the low-hanging fruit, then how do you really, coordinate all of this? And it takes a lot of effort to do this in a rational and meaningful way to make real change and to incent utilities to do these actions, because there still are going concerns in businesses, issues of stranded assets when you're trying to retire units and trying to move off of fossil generation. Where do you deploy monies because you need grid infrastructure improvements because they don't have the technology, they can't bring more renewables on, the system's maxed out. How do you incent new ways of thinking in terms of, do we do microgrids, do we use behind the meter customer resources? So all this has to be coordinated. And if you truly want to decarbonize, which is a separate issue, which we kind of alluded to here, it's integrating with other very significant sectors in this integrated energy network, transportation, and the power sector has a lot a key role to play in that as well. So it's all these moving pieces as we get to higher and higher levels of penetration of renewables that have to be coordinated, that have to be thought of in a thoughtful way, whether you're a decision maker like Senator Bhatia, or you're a regulator like myself, where I was, as at the Hawaii PUC, or you're an industry participant, or in an advocacy group, or the utility itself. It's a lot of hard work of coordinating this and having very specific dialogue about next actions and steps forward. Because we can talk all the platitudes we want, but if we don't get the details right, this won't happen, and we won't achieve the outcomes that we want to. And it's really, I think, one of the things that's going to really have to happen is the change of the business model, the change of the role of the utility, and all of us in the room have to facilitate that. And whether that's moving from cost of service regulation, which has its own barriers and challenges as a regulator, I will admit that, to a new way of metrics and outcome measures, which Hawaii is leading in terms of performance-based regulation, because utilities need to have the flexibility and the ability to earn revenue, but then still take these actions that make sense for the good of the community. And we have to figure that out in a better way. And there's a lot of barriers in the way the traditional utility construct works, the traditional cost of service regulation, that we need to address now if we want to get to where we want to go in 10, 15 years.
Thank you, Lorraine. Senator, what are your thoughts on the top challenges? Go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with Lorraine, and I think that every community, and I have looked very closely at her teachings, I would say, from Hawaii. We have learned a lot from Hawaii in Puerto Rico, being islands, and islands that have lots of sun. But we have looked at the experience of Hawaii. We have really come out with the conclusion that every community has to have its own flow chart, and its own flow chart, meaning that we all have to look at the hurdles, at the local community hurdles that we have, and try to identify what are the pressures for and what are the pressures against moving into renewable energy. In the case of Puerto Rico, I would say I have really become less of a philosopher and a visionary and more of a plumber. So I have to do the plumbing. And I have to really sit down and say, okay, if we all agree, first of all, that we have to move into renewable energy, and the good news is that the millennials and the new generations are all for it, and that is bringing momentum to the idea of clean energy. But then how do we move from that to the reality of, number one, the financial issues involving that transition? How do we transition into perhaps individual dwellings having to bear the expense of $15,000 or $20,000 or $25,000 to have solar panels? Or how do we move into the PPAs, into the power purchase agreements with the utility when the utility is resisting that? How do we move into solar and renewable energy when there are, in the case of Puerto Rico, bondholders who are owed $9 billion, and they are saying if you move into renewable energy, unless you put a tax on renewable energy, we will never see our money. So we're trying to figure out ways of circumventing all of these hurdles. And of course, the main hurdle, and I alluded to that initially, is the fact that the utility itself is making life miserable for those who are trying to move into renewable energy. We have recently approved legislation. It's called Act 17 of 2019 in Puerto Rico, mandating 50% of renewable energy by the year 2025. It's a very aggressive schedule, and having 100% by the year 2050. Now, the question then becomes how, beyond those mandates in the law, how do we make that happen? How do we execute those mandates? And what do we include in the law to make sure that those mandates are actually complied with? And that's where we are right now. That's exactly where we are. So we have the regulatory framework. We have the legal framework. We have the philosophy, we have the vision. We don't have the execution yet. The Department of Energy is helping us. The Rocky Mountain Institute is helping Puerto Rico. A number of other institutions have come to Puerto Rico to give us assistance, but we're still on the execution part, and I'm not sure we're moving forward at the speed that I would like right now.
Senator, thank you. I can just say, I think on all of our behalf, that we're so glad you're there helping lead that effort. It's so valuable and it's so challenging at the same time. Bryn, your thoughts on the one or two top challenges?
I mean, I think, again, from the customer side, the easy, single, most important challenge is access, the ability to choose renewables. And again, to color in the number of organizations who are setting these kinds of goals, it's half the Fortune 500 have a climate or clean energy goal. There's nearly 1,000 companies that have committed to a science-based target, most of which can't meet that without clean energy. You've got 200 companies setting 100% renewable energy, 100 cities. So all of this upwelling of demand is translating to, we need access. And then if you think about what the journey for many of these buyers looks like, they start with, okay, we've now got this public commitment we're on the hook to meet. How are we going to go out and get deals or sign up for products that get us access to the clean energy? And most companies, at least, have opted for the power purchase agreement route because it's a way for them to directly say, we've built that, we've caused that, we can claim that. But as many of you in this room probably know, if you've worked on these deals, these are incredibly complex. I mean, people joke about the races. Well, we got one done in 3 months, but most of them take a year or 2 years. And if you're a new buyer, trying to get up that learning curve is incredibly complex, not to mention that the deals themselves are actually potentially risky for buyers. And so the PPA has been a really important route for demonstrating progress in meeting these goals and pushing the system. But at the end of the day, it's not the answer. It's not the scalable way that we get from 100 buyers transacting today to 100,000 buyers tomorrow. And so when you look at what are the underlying market and policy structures that really impact access, that 25 gigawatts that has been contracted for so far, 80% of those deals have been done in organized markets, competitive wholesale markets, where there's an ability to clear a PPA. And so one aspect of solving the access problem is, well, how do you expand ability to sign PPAs in more places? But, again, if you're looking at the map, if you're a buyer and you're like, maybe not for a locality because you only have one choice, but if you're a buyer with locations in multiple states, you're looking at the map and you're saying, well, I can do a PPA here. Do I have other options with my vertically integrated utility? What's the utility offering? We've seen a steady march and increase of green tariffs across the country. There were only 2, one in your home state,
yes,
7 years ago. We've now got 26 tariffs in, I think, 22 states. The challenge there, though, is that you can count them on one hand. How many of those green tariffs you've had multiple customers sign up for? More than 5. And I think that's an indication of, are these being designed in a way that really work for lots of customers? Because again, if you come back to what's going to scale this, the participation, you've got buyers that are hungry to help drive this transition, but if they're never going to be able to sign a PPA, what's your option? We need to find ways to start to aggregate these buyers. Utilities are natural partners in this. They're natural aggregators. But there's also other answers. So we'll get into the solutions, I'm sure, but I think access really is the pinpoint as the key challenge from the buyer perspective.
Thank you, Bryn. Thank you. Well, Mark, this is going to be a smooth ride, right? Integrating all this stuff, no problem, right?
Well, building on the comments you just heard, I could not agree more that, I think we're all amazingly thankful and impressed with the cost reductions we've seen with renewables and now storage. This is an amazing world we live in where, the cost of a lot of this new technology is actually cheaper than maintaining the status quo with the older stuff, right? We should all be thankful for that. That's amazing. But it's still, as was just discussed, it's still not easy to build the projects, especially at the scale that we need to. And, oh, by the way, to get to even our goals by 2030, we have to basically scale up what we're doing in all sectors, whether that's distributed or utility scale, by a factor of probably 3 or 4 times as much as we're installing each year now. We have to be doing that every year between now, really till 2050 to get where we want to go, I think. And that's a formidable logistics issue. you're absolutely right that it's been easier in the organized markets, the restructured markets in the mainland here. But even that is becoming very difficult because we're putting this new technology into these rules that were designed for conventional resources. And the whole process of interconnecting and changing the market rules to adapt to what we want to do with new technology is very, very onerous and expensive and risky. So I think there's huge issues here just on the logistics and the rules wherever you are. We have to continue to evolve those to be embracing this new technology rather than resisting it. I think we'll get there, but it is a battle. It takes several years to build these projects at the utility scale, for example, and there's a high amount of risk. And then we say, well, I can add a battery to that, and I can make it even a better plant for you. Well, that's great, but now you have to go back to the end of the queue, and there's going to be these other costs of interconnecting, even though it's better. So we're running into lots of issues like that are challenging. So I view the logistics as a big issue. The reliability, as I mentioned, it's more of a coordination issue. There's a lot of great work that we're doing at ESIG and Grid Lab and working with NERC and all this on that. We'll get there, but that also is facing a lot of, basically standards and rules that were designed for a different world. And I view this as the digital revolution finally hitting the energy sector, right? I mean, all these other industries, whether you point at music or communications or photography, I mean, years ago they were completely transformed by these new types of technologies that were all, software and electronics. And that's the verge we're on here that makes reliability interesting as a big challenge, is we now have to do that for the entire energy industry and particularly the grid while maintaining the level of reliability that we're used to. So, a lot of fascinating problems, none of which are insurmountable, but we just have to coordinate and determine which pathway we're going to take, and we have to then get society to support us in doing those pathways.
Thank you, Mark. So I want to ask our panelists now if they'll talk a little bit about solutions and strategies that they propose to get us over this hump and get us going at confronting these obstacles. Lorraine?
I think there are solutions. I think we've identified the challenges, and part of this, is in the regulatory sector. I think regulators have a key role to play in terms of tariffs, so that things like demand response and also energy efficiency. In Hawaii, we have energy efficiency portfolio standards because we can't get to 100% clean energy without the other tools in the toolkit: energy efficiency and demand response. And I think Larry alluded to that in the opening remarks for today's summit. These are key tools. They have to be treated with the same certainty as the other tools in the toolkit. When we're talking about, utility scale plants or distributed energy resources coming onto the grid, energy efficiency and demand response are also part of that mix because that allows us to get to 100% faster, cheaper, and more accessible and affordable. It also involves customers. So I think that is a solution. In Hawaii, what we've done, we've gone through iterations, net energy metering, getting the tariffs right to incent customers to provide energy and capacity, ancillary services to the grid, because as Mark alluded, the technology now allows that. So regulators have to also put into place a framework of tariffs that incent that. And in Hawaii, I direct you to some of the tariffs that we worked on between 2014 to now: customer grid supply, smart export, customer grid supply plus storage. Because when you get to a high penetration of renewables, it's not the energy anymore. It's the capacity, the ancillary services that, as Mark said, these new technology tools can provide. And in fact, we can avoid a costly transformer upgrade, or we can avoid maybe a transmission upgrade or a substation upgrade. And so in many jurisdictions that are embracing 100% renewable, the regulators are also requiring utilities to look at non-wires alternatives first. Is there a more cost-effective way to give access, reliability, and serve this area and to deal with the energy needs in this area, and pushing also integrated resource planning for those jurisdictions that don't do it, really making sure utilities look at a very coordinated picture of what they project demand to be, what supply there is, what constraints there are. So we're not, doing this as a one-off or in a very chaotic manner. Regulators have a role to play in that, as well as giving regulatory certainty. And I think I want to give a shout out again to the Hawaii PUC, because back in 2014, there's a lot of activity happening in California and New York with the New York Rev, and California with a lot of the energy storage requirements. I think Hawaii saw that there is a strategic need to move forward, and so we issued the inclinations on Hawaii's utilities of the future, which laid forth a strategic roadmap. It gave regulatory certainty that we're going to treat DERs, we're going to treat energy efficiency, demand response, electric vehicles, and energy storage as generation resources. So you shall plan accordingly using these resources. That was very different from what was happening elsewhere, where people were still debating, what is this? Is this are these DERs? Are they generation? Are they really ancillary services? Where do we put this? We need to give regulatory certainty, because under the current model, Wall Street, the investors, shareholders, they need regulatory certainty to move forward, to know that they can invest in these things, and it frees up resources for other needed investments. So I think that is the most important thing that we can solve, at least from the regulator's perspective. We can do the right tariffs, incent the right actions, and then get out of the way and let the market respond.
Thank you, Lorraine. I see Senator Bhatia shaking his head. I think he wants to recruit you to come there. Senator Bhatia, your thoughts on solutions and strategies that can help us?
Lorraine has been to Puerto Rico, and we would welcome her again. She wants to move down here. We're happy to have her. I agree with everything she said, and I would say that part of what we have to do in terms of the solutions in Puerto Rico, of course, we had to create a regulator. We're one of the last jurisdictions in the world to have a utility regulator. We did not have one. So we had one established in 2014. It's the Puerto Rico Energy Commission. I would say we were the last to come in. However, Puerto Rico is the first jurisdiction in the U.S. to have a microgrid regulation by our regulator. So it's good news is that bad news is that we came in last. First, good news is that we're coming out with new regulations pushing for renewable energy on the island. So in terms of the solutions, that's one thing we did. Now, I have a special place in this panel because I am a politician. That's good and the bad. And I would say you have to make renewable energy, from my standpoint, you have to make it a political issue. It's important that all communities understand the variables involved and the reasons why renewable energy matter. And I say that as a solution because other than the technical part that the regulators deal with, other than the financial dealing with Wall Street, I think people, citizens, have to become used to new words that are emerging. The idea of we don't want you to be a consumer anymore. We want you to be a prosumer. Well, citizens look at me and say, what is that? What does it mean to be a prosumer? So I would say there has to be a campaign. If you want to call it a media campaign, if you want to call it a political campaign, it's an awareness campaign that I think it's extremely important for solutions to be developed. I visited with some elementary school kids the other day, and I was telling them about the transition that we have to make, and I used the wrong analogy because I told them, do you remember when we used to have payphones? They had no idea what payphones were. But the idea is that we have to disrupt, and we have to embrace the energy disruption that is happening throughout the world. And embracing that means that we used to do energy burning fossil fuels, and we have a new technology, just like we have cell phones, and just like you can deposit your check on your bank account, just taking a picture of your check, or even you don't even use checks anymore. So I think part of what we have to do in this process is and I really want to stress that part because the public has to be part of the solution, and the public has to pressure regulators, governments, and private sector businessmen to allow for the bridge to be built so that the transition is smoothly. And again, I have to say it gets ugly sometimes. It gets ugly because there's a pushback. There's a pushback. Puerto Rico itself buys $3 billion a year in oil for its utility to burn. So, of course, the guy, the person, the business that sells the oil is completely sending all of their resources and their lobbyists to fight us. And that kind of pushback requires leadership and requires citizens to be engaged.
Thank you, Senator. Bryn, your thoughts on solutions?
I completely agree with everything the Senator just said, because it ties into, well, who's going to be the center of this transition and really help drive it? Yes, you need the infrastructure and the logistics around it, and then enable consumers to be prosumers. They're pro something, and let them be pro clean energy. So the way that we kind of think about how do you do that is along two tracks. Because on the one hand, again, back to the previous points about, well, how many of these consumers, especially even when you're talking about individuals, are not going to go buy renewable energy from a specific project? This has to be about how you green the grid overall for all customers. And so what are the tools in the toolbox for that pathway? One, certainly, as I think we've really started to see this this uptake and expansion of 100% clean energy standards. And I think that's a really positive move from a consumer perspective, because it means you're bringing everybody along. And we've actually had some major buyers, big brands that you would recognize, say, yeah, we've signed over 1,000 gigawatts of renewable energy contracts by ourselves, but if the grid were greening fast enough, we would be very happy to say we're going to go along for the ride. But that becomes a question of pace. These folks are not content to sit around and wait for the grid to green by 2050, even though that feels like the right kind of time frame. That's our deadline. These consumers, especially the big companies, are saying, we've got to do this by 2040. Can we do it by 2035? And can we help get that to happen? So I think part of this is also thinking about how can customers be seen as partners in this transition? How can they help accelerate? So for example, there's now some ideas around how to design clean energy standards in a way that allow provisions for accelerated renewable energy buyers who want to and can go further faster, reduce the compliance needs of the utility, and you basically can accelerate the whole process, potentially at lower cost. So I think clean energy standards are still key. Utility commitments are now starting to take off as well. I think there's around 22 utilities that have deep decarbonization, voluntary commitments. Again, that depends on how concrete their plans are for meeting those commitments, and really, I think customers, again, have a bit of a role to hold feet to the fire on making sure that those are being met. And then I think, so that's in the greening the grid side of things. And then I think the other side is, how do we actually give customers options? And again, back to the point about organized markets, I think expanding access to organized markets, it's a big lift, but it's absolutely critical, not just for customer options, but for renewable energy integration, for driving down costs. We all know that these markets save customers billions of dollars annually. So this is, from a customer perspective, sort of a no-brainer thing that, can we get this done next year? No, but this is an underlying market structure that we've got to have to accelerate this transition. And then likewise, I think customers really engaging along with other parties to move the utilities in expanding whether it's subscription style products or those kinds of things that allow both individuals and organizations to opt into clean energy. I think all of those tools are part of the toolbox.
Thank you, Bryn. Mark, your thoughts on solutions and strategies to get there?
Well, the reason I really was excited to participate today is I think we're really at a time where, having this broader range, this collaboration throughout the whole spectrum of the industry has never been more important. I mean, especially the engineers, of course, are notoriously stereotyped as being down in their little silo, working on this particular hard problem, which is great. But we need more people that are generalists and can look at how everything fits together. And that's why I'm really pushing ESIG this year, for example, to say it's great that we have all the experts and have these great workshops. Well, how are we going to distill that down to the message for the regulators and the decision makers and the policy makers, right? So we have to find ways, like you're doing here at this workshop today, to really bridge that spectrum where, we don't all have to know all the details, but we have to know what's important and what has to be coordinated and what has to be done. So I think that's a key part of it, is is doing that. Certainly the expansion of the organized markets in a way and changing the market rules is critical as well, because, if you're going to do this at the scales we're talking about, it's going to be much more reliable and much cheaper if we look at this, whether it's distributed or utility scale, as part of a system, right? So the growth of that and how we do this, more than just, an individual utility, more than just an individual state, but start looking at it more as a national problem, as well, is certainly important. And transmission, by the way, is certainly a vital part of that allows us to do that, especially here in the mainland. Even though we do a lot of distributed, we're also going to need to have a backbone infrastructure, preferably one that spans the whole country by the time we're done. That's going to make that, lower cost, more reliable for all citizens. So that's the challenge, I think, is that level of having a broad perspective, how we coordinate and how we socialize that more broadly. And a big part of that is, we've got to, the experts in any field, whether that's on the regulatory or, performance-based regulation, or whether that's on the, stability and reliability type issues, we have to find better ways of communicating each other at the right level so that everybody is educated and informed on this, and we can make logical decisions on, on complicated, very interrelated problems.
Thank you, Mark. So as we go about establishing the regulatory and policy frameworks that are going to be needed to encourage private sector adoption of clean energy, what are the things I want to ask the panel that regulators and legislators should keep in mind in going about doing that and establishing these frameworks? And I'll start with Lorraine.
Yeah, I think it's really a very challenging balance, because especially like say for island grids, and Senator Bhatia can weigh in, where each island, especially in Hawaii, is its own energy ecosystem. There's no energy imbalance market, so there's no organized market. So if you can trade across borders, or you can send excess energy, you can leverage some of that resourcing across state lines. Everything has to be within that little energy ecosystem. So as legislators, policymakers, regulators, it's balancing those competing interests, because when you're on a small island, land use issues matter. And now we're seeing, which is kind of surprising, we're seeing some pushback, in terms of people are reacting, even though they want to get to 100% renewable energy and 100% clean. There's pushback for various reasons. Maybe it's NIMBYism. I don't want that, solar farm in my backyard. I don't want that big wind farm near my community. And it takes a lot of consumer education, public education, engagement, working groups, dialogue, which is a lot of work for legislators and their constituents, and for decision makers and regulators to have hearings, to hear from people, to vent concerns, and then make decisions, and coordination with energy departments or agencies that are doing land use planning, energy resource planning, trying to coordinate with transportation as well. And it is a real concerted effort that has to be undertaken to dialogue on these issues, because if you don't, then you're going to get a lawsuit, things get delayed. As Mark alluded to, there's risks, liability. You end up costing more to get to the same place that you want to get to. So I think that legislators, decision makers, policymakers need to keep that in mind. But then there's the constant need to also be addressing reliability and resilience concerns. So it really is, it's a real balancing act, and there's not infinite resources in terms of monies sometimes. So that's why dialoguing, that's why having very engaged community participation, whether it's the large businesses that are large customers, government agencies that are large customers of the utilities themselves, consumer groups, environmental groups that are pushing back. We haven't even talked about, when we're really trying to migrate off of fossil fuel, that's the bioenergy market, biofuels, maybe involving the other big utility area in the power sector, which is the gas sector, as they're trying to decarbonize, leveraging resources. And that takes a concerted effort in every community, in every state, in every jurisdiction. It is not easy, but that's the kind of commitment we need if we want to get to 100%.
Thank you, Lorraine. Senator, your thoughts on this? On established?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I would say I would like to share a little bit of my experience, but also it would be great perhaps for IREC 2021 to see how those 150 jurisdictions, states, and localities that have established 100% renewable, how are they convincing their citizens to pressure their elected officials? My personal experience is most legislators don't enter into the energy area. They see it as foreign. They see it as something to stay away from. It's a technical issue. If you sit down with them and talk to them about, paying 20 cents per kilowatt hour or 15 cents, they don't really know what you're talking about. So there's a great level of education that has to take place. And I will say, when folks out there want to talk about, crime and crime prevention and healthcare and education, energy doesn't come, at least in Puerto Rico, doesn't come at the top of the list unless there is a connection. And this is where I would answer your question. There has to be a connection between what we're doing and economic development and job creation and schools and how schools will be run and how families will have a more resilient energy for emergencies. So I think a great deal of what we have to do is create that connection, that serious connection between everyday lives and what we're talking about in this panel, which is, regulatory issues, which is financial issues, which is Wall Street, which is, and those issues don't really connect with everyday citizens. So I think part of the great challenge that we have to do is, educate legislators and make them part of the alliance that has to take place, but also sharing experiences and developing the kind of faith that is required for some folks to break away from the old system or from the existing system into a new world. I think we're still working on that, and I'm not sure. Again, we're moving at the speed that I would like. Perhaps I'm an eternal frustrated person because I would like things to move faster. But the experience of Puerto Rico really is that I have had to spend a lot of time making that connection. Why do we have to move into renewable energy? Because it's cheaper, because it's safer, because we're doing the right thing for the environment, but also because we will create jobs. I have to make that connection always.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you. Bryn, your thoughts?
I mean, I think I would just echo certainly some of these points about we've got to sell this, and it's from the customer perspective. There's definitely a business case, but I think people are also really interested in the stories they can tell about the health impacts, the local community benefits that are created by the jobs created, and building the local tax base. So, leveraging the customers in ways to help tell those stories is going to be important. But I think the thing I would point to in terms of a key consideration for legislators and regulators is ambition, because now is the time to be bold. And I think if there's a lesson from the last 10 years or so, the commitments that the U.S. set out 10 years ago never actually passed into law. We've retreated from the Paris Agreement. But we've actually gotten a good bit of the way there without passing anything into law. And I think the lesson there is not that, see, we could do it without it. It was that we aimed too low. And I think part of this is that, as costs have come down, we've proven that this is doable, that there are real benefits. Now is the time to be aiming high and setting bold commitments for how do we actually, reach full decarbonization, especially in the power sector, because if we can move faster in the power sector, we've got a whole bunch of other challenges in other sectors that we're going to need a little bit more time to figure out. We can I think studies are showing we can get 70, 80% of the way there in the power sector with today's technology. So let's move as fast as we can so we have time to figure out how to get the last 20%, let alone, as you've pointed out, some of the other intersections to other sectors. And I think customers, again, can be one of those key accelerants. Empower them to move faster, because some of them can move faster. It helps buy us time. So I think that's really the key consideration. But as ever, design matters, and so costs and driving value as we design these policies and also building transparency into all of this is going to be really critical. But again, the ambition really matters, because as Mark was talking about, even when you get into things like transmission planning processes, how do we get some of the cheap effective resources out of the middle of the country to where the demand is. There's a lot of this happening where folks say, well, there's no mandate to do this, so why are we going to go build more of this? So without that North Star and rowing all in the same direction, there's too much of, well, we don't have a mandate to do this, and we end up just treading water.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bryn. Mark, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I've agonized about actually are these 100% goals, and I've come to terms with it, as was just mentioned, that really the technology is there. It's amazing because it was not so many. It was like 15 years ago. We were doing integration studies where the utilities and grid operators said, well, how do I even do a few hundred megawatts of wind and keep everything working? And now we've shown that, with good studies and modeling, that you do have the technology, certainly to get to that 70-80% annual penetration level. And the perception of wanting to get to 100% should not be a barrier for doing that. And we see a lot of pushback from certain organizations and people that say, well, we don't know how to get that last 20%, therefore, it's outrageously expensive, we're going to see this hockey stick. That is complete garbage, to be honest, right? We've never seen that with other technologies. The reality is we know how to get to these high levels, get to 70-80%. It's more of a logistic and coordination issue to do that. By the time we get there, we will have a lot of technologies to go to that last 20% if we choose to do that. But I totally agree. The reason we changed the name of the organization to the Energy Systems Integration Group is it's going to be more than just the grid by the time we're done. The grid is going to be a cornerstone of that. But, it could well be that we'll get to 80% clean energy on the electricity system, and then the low-hanging fruit will be, well, how do we get carbon reductions elsewhere? So we have to keep in mind that our number one goal here is carbon reductions, for society and for the world. And we have to look at what is the most cost-effective and prudent thing to do in terms of how we plan that forward. Eventually getting 100%, I fully believe. But, we have to do it in a logical way. So there shouldn't be a perception that there's a technical barrier for the policy goals that we have in place. And I think we need to fight against that strongly if people say, well, just because we don't know how to get that last few percent, it's not worth doing. That is just completely wrong. So I think we have to be clear on that message that we can do this.
Thank you, Mark. We can do it. We can do it. Well, this panel's been a moderator's dream, let me tell you. Can I have a round of applause for that outstanding panel? And I particularly want to thank Lorraine and Senator Bhatia for joining us from Hawaii and Puerto Rico, because their perspective on this, really, they're cutting edge, they're on the leading edge. It really is important for us to learn from that. So thank you all. What we're going to do now is break. We're going to give you a break.
Thank you.
And I once again thank all our panelists. Thank you, Senator Bhatia, Mark Ahlstrom.
Thank you.
Bryn Baker and Lorraine Akiba. What? Do we have time?
Thank you.
Do we have time? So hang on just a second. I'm told we have time for a couple of questions. I thought I was getting the cut, but actually we've got time, and this is great. So who's got a burning question? Back in the back. Come on up to the mic and
this works.
Yes,
it works. Thank you, guys. And this is Jorge Camacho. This question is actually for Mark. I am very glad that we have Puerto Rico and Hawaii. We're spending a little time in Puerto Rico, and I want to say that the DOE is heavily involved providing assistance to the Energy Commission. That Senator Bhatia that's his brainchild. And that's fantastic. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we're hearing, we got engaged HICO, and this is for Mark. And one of the things that HICO is telling us, this is Ken Fong, Mark, Isena, is that, listen, guys, in order for you to make sure that you can actually be equipped to keep increasing the adoption of renewable, think about inverter standards. So Ken is telling us, if I had done this in the past, I would have thought about those standards earlier on. So in rice and beans, Mark, what does that mean, like, to a jurisdiction like Puerto Rico?
Great question. There has been a lot of work because, the early inverters, it was just how cheaply can you get the energy injected into the system, right? It was not about, you're going to become the core of the system and therefore have to provide reliability services and all these other ancillary services in addition to energy. And increasingly it is, especially on an instantaneous basis, where there's going to be certain hours or 5-minute periods out of the day where you're going to want to run the grid almost 100% off of those inverters. So we have had some teething pains with that technology. There's a couple things going on. One is that at the distributed level, there's a standard called IEEE 1547, which at least gives the options to the regulators on how you want to set these inverters and have these capabilities. There's an equivalent kind of activity right now, a new standard to apply that to the bulk system called IEEE P2800 that's in process right now. But going beyond that, there's a lot of work on what we call grid-forming inverters. And what we mean by that is that today's inverters are meant to have kind of a strong grid there, and they're just supposed to follow what happens on that grid and not do bad things to it. Well, now you have to transition to where at least some of the time these inverters might actually have to be the cornerstone that sets the reliability, the frequency, the stability of that grid. And there's various ways to do that. We're a lot of great technology. That's what we've been talking about, at our ESIG meetings and our discussions about the pathways toward 100%. That's not a standard product from the manufacturers right now. It's slightly more expensive, but not a lot. It just, again, we have to decide, well, how are you going to do that and how do you want it to be set for your particular system? But the technology will be there. It's getting the vendors to kind of step up to that next generation of inverters and agreeing on how we're going to use all that. There's been modeling done that shows you actually can run a grid with 100% inverters. The real challenge is the transition about, well, how do you run that grid when it's 90% inverters and you still have some of those conventional resources, and because you don't want to hurt those conventional resources either, right? So that's what we're really debating here is how we're going to make that transition. I mean, we've actually run systems on 100% inverters all the time, like on ships and microgrids and so forth. So we know it's possible, but to do it at the large scale for the entire system, that's the issue we're dealing with for this transition.
I think Lorraine wanted to make a comment.
Yeah,
Mark, thank you.
I would like to direct those and probably in the audience are working in the space know about that, but it is really important for the regulatory standards to reflect the industry standards, in real time, and it's kind of like California and Hawaii are kind of playing tag in terms of who's really leading in terms of making sure the interconnection standards and the tariffs sync up when those standards change. When IEEE 1547 was released, we had to change the interconnection standards and the tariffs immediately so that it wouldn't delay interconnection, it wouldn't delay the projects that are in the queue, it would incent more of the renewables coming on. So Rule 14H is the tariff in Hawaii. I would direct you there. We're finally finishing up through the DER work group in Hawaii, finishing that up. Rule 21 is leading right now. We were kind of playing tag initially with interconnection standards on the DER side, but now, Rule 21 has completed that process. Rule 14H is right there. So I would direct your attention to the California tariff for Rule 21, the Hawaii tariffs for Rule 14H. And again, the way we've done it in Hawaii, which I would encourage, and what I was talking about before, is technical working groups have to constantly stay engaged in this. It's not like a one-off where you have a docket, people come together, you argue, decisions made. These technical working groups must stay in place constantly, continually, and we've kept them in place in Hawaii because you're constantly reiterating, going back when there are changes. And there are to Jorge's question, there are power control systems and the energy storage systems themselves, the batteries, that you can use the reactive power. That's what we're talking about, virtual power plant demonstrations going on all across the country. In Hawaii, we have OATI and Sunrun doing a virtual power plant. Harness those resources on the rooftops so that you can have a virtual power plant, microgrids. You can use different resources already on the grid under the old legacy systems. And as people are upgrading their legacy systems, harness that reactive power, harness the new technology in both the storage side and in both the inverter side. And some of these power control systems, even in old wind, not older, but they're there in the more, traditional wind farms can also be harnessed. So that's something looking back at what is in the portfolio.
Thank you, Lorraine. One last question.
Hi, I'm Yulia with Utility Dive. Thank you for your time. I was wondering, just in light of all of the new creative and innovative PPAs that have been happening in the last year, what do regulators need to do to unlock this option for smaller customers in the C&I sector, for more users in general to tap into flexible and innovative, maybe PPA portfolios, as we've seen?
Who'd like to take that one on? Bryn?
I can start. I think there's been a number of different types of programs that particularly vertically integrated utilities have offered, and I think the most promising for scale is a subscription style program. So instead of a bilateral agreement or one that's sort of load specific, or you have to have a certain load factor to qualify, these more open bound tariffs where it's the utility goes out and procures a portfolio of resources, and then groups of customers can opt in and opt out easily. There's less risk transferred onto the customer. The terms are more flexible. Ultimately, the push-pull is how do you balance the risk and between the utility and the customer in those kinds of arrangements. But it's trying to move the direction in recognizing that utilities are these natural aggregators, and the more the utilities can balance the risk across pools of customers instead of customers trying to figure out, well, we've got an anchor of Apple and then two more smaller companies can tack on to that. That's how some aggregation projects have been done to date. But I think moving where you've got pools of resources and pools of customers, and the utility already knows how to dynamically manage those, but it's just a renewable asset, then the question becomes, how does the regulator approve more of those kinds of programs and dealing with some of these cost shift questions? And I think that there's Puget Sound Energy, Westar in Kansas, Georgia Power in Georgia. There's some innovative models happening there where they've been able to thread that needle of saying, we're going out, procuring new resources. We can show that there's no cost being transferred onto other non-participating customers. So the bottom line is it can be done. We just need to see more of those programs scaled and replicated.
All right, well, I want to thank our panelists today. Can I hear a round of applause for them?